Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I will review today is Lolita. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of Lolita with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. Lolita is a 1955 novel written by the Russian writer Vladimir Nabokov. The book was originally written in English and later translated into Russian by Nabokov himself. Lolita is a controversial work because of the subject it deals with, and perhaps because of or in spite of this reputation, the novel has been ever popular, and also is considered one of the greatest literary works of the 20th century. Vladimir Nabokov was born in the Russian Empire to a well-educated aristocratic family, and because of their social position, they had to leave the country during the Russian Revolution. He lived in Germany until the war, which forced him to move again, this time to the US, where he spent a couple of decades, but I think he never really adapted to the place. His opinion of America and the Americans is made rather evident through the observations and comments made by the Lolita's protagonists. Eventually he came back to Europe and settled in Switzerland, where he spent the rest of his life. Some compare Nabokov to Joseph Conrad, which he disliked, probably because he considered himself a better writer, but I prefer Conrad because I connect more with his subject and writing style. What is Lolita about? For some people it is difficult not to use words such as pedophilia and sexual abuse when describing it, but I think the theme is much more subtle and less obvious. There is the impact of the childhood traumas on our adult psychology and the way they project themselves later in our lives. Also, the book explores the power of emotions over logic and how this can explain the self-destructive and unreasonable decisions we sometimes make. A bit of the plot. The base of the novel is a personal memoir written in prison by a man named Humbert, who is awaiting a murder trial. It is an autobiographical account that goes from his birth in Paris to the arrest and imprisonment. Humbert begins with describing his childhood, the death of his mother when he was 3 years old, and the broad education, including sexual theory, he received from his intellectual father. Then he moves to his adolescent years and his first love with its tragic end, and how this trauma defined the later trajectory of his life with its somewhat predictable end. After graduating from the university, Humbert becomes an English teacher and literary editor. Later, he receives a yearly inheritance from an uncle on a condition that he comes to live in the US. Once in the country, he moves around a bit and eventually, and somewhat by accident, rents a room in the house where Lolita, who is a 12-year-old girl named Dolores, lives with her mother. Upon seeing her, he envisions the reincarnation of his first love and becomes infatuated, or the more appropriate word would be obsessed. And this is the beginning of his abnormal relationship with the girl. Further, because of some accidental circumstances, he becomes Lolita's guardian and gains some legal power over her, which he exploits. But life is not perfect, and there appears another contender and competitor for Lolita's favors, which leads to a subtle and somewhat gentlemanly, but also furious and persistent struggle for the girl. And that's the basic plot. What did I think about Lolita? The novel is beautifully written, even if you have a problem with its subject matter. It comes across as very French, despite being written in the US in English and by a Russian. There are many verses in the book written in French, and I think the use of French is there to give Humbert an intellectual depth. Further, by turning the book into the main character's confession, Nabokov cleverly avoids giving his own opinion about Humbert and his deeds, thus limiting any personal judgments and accusation against himself. And it also gives him plenty of writing freedom with very little moral restrictions. I watched an interview with Nabokov where he was asked why he wrote Lolita, and he seems to struggle a bit with an answer, even though I am sure he must have imagined being asked the very question and must have prepared some type of plausible answer. He says, "Why do I write any of my books? For the sake of pleasure, for the sake of difficulty. You see, I have no social purpose, no moral message, but I like composing riddles." To me, the spontaneity of his answer seemed a bit rehearsed. Nabokov was a chess player and dedicated much time to it, so I cannot imagine him not anticipating the coming questions, especially one as obvious as the reason for writing the novel. Actually, Lolita's plot can be seen as a chess match where Humbert analyzes and anticipates future behavior and reactions to his actions of the people around him, such as Lolita and her mother. And also later, when Humbert is forced to face his rival, who I like to call Uncle, in a game of guessing and anticipation between two predators competing for their prey, Lolita. I am using the word Uncle when referring to Humbert's adversary, partly not to call him by his given name, even though later in the novel, when disclosing who Uncle is, Nabokov writes that his true identity must have been obvious to the reader much sooner. But I think Nabokov was too generous with and overestimated the intellectual perception of his readers, at least mine. Anyway, somebody called Uncle also brings to mind an elderly dirty man bribing kids with sweets and favors to gain their confidence and affection so he can practice his perversions. Humbert hates Uncle not only because Uncle wants what he considers his, and because he feels there is some emotional connection between Lolita and the Uncle, which he never managed to establish himself, but he also hates him because Uncle is kind of a mirror and reflects his own image, and maybe subconsciously he wants to kill Uncle because he wants to kill himself. But consciously he doesn't accept it, and when he finally faces the Uncle, his first thought is, "To know this semi-animated, subhuman trickster had sodomized my darling," which he might have said about himself. The two main personalities, Humbert and Dolores, aka Lolita, are explored in different capacities since they both are seen through the eyes of Humbert, of whom we get a more profound psychological profile since it is a self-portrait, but because of it, it also is pretty biased. Humbert is a European. Why? Possibly because in general, Europeans are psychologically more complex than Americans as the result of a long and complicated history. So Humbert's undefined European background adds a bit of mystery to the story. Also, Nabokov might be metaphorically injecting a little of Europe's obsession with America. Humbert is Europe, old, wise, and experienced, but also damaged, pessimistic, and arrogant, and he wants Lolita, who is America, young, happy, and beautiful, but also naive and a bit foolish. Humbert is an intellectual, sexually frozen in time because he is unable, and more so unwilling, to move on. He's smart enough to know what he's doing and the implications and possible consequences of his acts. That's why he throughoutly analyzes the motives for his behavior. He's well aware of the whys of his actions and lets us know that it is the teenage trauma of his first love for the girl named Annabelle. He says, "I am convinced that Lolita began with Annabelle, and there might not have been Lolita if there was no Annabelle." But Humbert seems unwilling to seek cure. Well, Lolita might be seen as a possible cure for his trauma, but he prefers to just see her as a fix for his perverse needs, since it is obvious he doesn't want to control nor rectify his behavior. So perhaps the memory of Annabelle is just an excuse to indulge in his pedophilic tendencies. He tries to justify his abnormal desires by quoting doctor's verbal confirmation that an estimated 12% of American males at some time in their lives have enjoyed sexual rendezvous with a child. He tries to justify his abnormal desires by quoting doctor's verbal confirmation that an estimated 12% of American males at some time in their lives have enjoyed sexual rendezvous with a child. Further, he also makes an effort to psychologically, since he can't do it physically, separate the targets of his sexual desires from children. He develops a somewhat convincing, at least to himself, theory of nymphets and describes them as sexual demonic spirits possessing the bodies of children. He says he is unable to hurt an innocent child, but nymphets are not children. Humbert also believes that Annabelle, just like Lolita, was a nymphet, and that's why their short but intense love maintains its destructive power over his adult life. The appeal of the novel, or specifically of Humbert himself, is that he is a seducer, successful with his targets, but even more so with his audience. For him, it is not just the carnal satisfaction, but the whole experience of getting there. He surrounds himself with Lolita's things and poetically describes a lone shopping trip to buy clothes for her. He brags about his seductive powers and boyish good looks, but the way he does it doesn't diminish its impact and influence. Humbert is a complex individual dealing with depression and even episodes of insanity. He seems a psychopath and he tries to rationalize his behavior, but it is more of self-defense than seeking cure or showing remorse. He sees many of Lolita's actions as seductive and provoking, but perhaps it is he who provokes them and she childishly plays along. But Humbert has also some lucid moments and realizes he destroyed Lolita's childhood when he says, "Any childhood is better than a parody of incest, and that's what I offered." Perhaps he hoped that Lolita would be the last one and would bring him out of the vicious circle of reliving his adolescent love. In the end, he realized he didn't know Lolita very well, and he saw her just as a symbol, not a human being, with a lot more to her than he chose to recognize. Dolores, transformed by Humbert into Lolita, is shown through Humbert's eyes, with focus on what he's interested in. And because of it, she is very superficial and incomplete as a personality. There is Dolores, who is a normal teenager, maybe not normal but human, in whom Humbert has little interest. Dolores seems intelligent and overdeveloped for her age, possibly not physically but psychologically. She seems to have had previous adolescent sexual experiences at the camp with boys and girls, so perhaps she is more prepared to handle her relationship with Humbert and even show some initiative, at least according to Humbert's perception. Then there is Lolita, his fantasy that never grows and never ages. She is not real, but somewhat of a ghost that can change physical bodies, moving from one teenager to another and injecting the spirit of Lolita into each one, to keep Humbert's sexual fantasy alive forever. He even imagines Lolita having his child, who at 8 or 9 could become a daughter Lolita, and then there would be granddaughter Lolita, which he imagines would keep him sexually satisfied and happy for the rest of his life. The relationship between the two might seem a slave dominated by a master, but the link is a complex power play, not unlike the exchange between child and parent. Humbert gives Lolita allowance and buys her gifts in exchange for her submission and sexual favors, and often she wants more than he initially offers, So they subtly and indirectly negotiate. Humbert is a master manipulator, and he tries to keep Lolita dependent on him as much as possible. And maybe not in a state of fear, but worried about what will happen to her if they are discovered. He is also insecure about Lolita's commitment, and because of it he controls her, such as the amount of money she is accumulating from her allowance to make sure she doesn't have enough to escape. And he also monitors her social interactions with other children and adults. Lolita herself is pretty aware of what is going on and enjoys playing to Humbert's insecurities and keeping him on the edge through indirect but clear comments such as this one. What was the name of the place we stayed at the first night? You know, the place by the lake. What was it called? You know, the place where you raped me? And she gets up and runs away to let him chew on it alone. She also likes to stir his jealousy by telling him stories of her own transgressions or flirts with others in his presence. The book also seems to question love. What is it, and does Humbert love Lolita? He himself adds to the confusion when he says, I knew I fell in love with Lolita forever, and I also knew she would not be Lolita forever. So he loves Lolita, but not Dolores. Perhaps further, through Humbert, Nabokov is making a case that love can be anything because it is undefined. Most people see it as something positive, beautiful and romantic, but it also can be a negative force, hurtful and destructive, and its definition is only limited by the so-called moral values of each individual and society. There are cultures that find homosexual relationships disgusting and reprehensible, and at the same time view Humbert-like behavior as perfectly normal. We ourselves, the Western Christian society, were there not so long ago. Basically, all laws and moral rules are relative and are always seen in the context of time and place. To sum it up, Lolita is a controversial novel, especially considering the time and the place it was written in. 1950s America, where books like Tropic of Cancer and Naked Lunch were banned. So it is no surprise that Lolita was first published in Paris. You got to love the French, even if it is only for their sexual liberation and tolerance. Thanks to them and the Obelisk and later Olympia Press, we can enjoy many great works that otherwise might have been nothing more than a dusty manuscript in somebody's basement. Until the 1960s and the Supreme Court case that challenged U.S. obscenity laws, many literary connoisseurs from the English-speaking world would take a trip to Paris just to replenish their library with the titles not available in their home country. Anyway, the prose and the descriptions in Lolita are exquisite, and the sporadic use of French makes it sound sophisticated and gives Humbert a deeper intellectual dimension. Perhaps Nabokov's point is that everything is relative, and he tries to prove it by using language and subjectivity to turn somebody who under normal circumstances we would consider despicable into a somewhat sympathetic and even likable character. Lolita is a perfect example of how language influences our perception. Nabokov, through Humbert, seduces his readers with somewhat mesmerizing language and subtle descriptions. If the book was written as a crime report, our feelings about Humbert would be different, despite his actions being exactly the same. I think to enjoy or appreciate Lolita, one should try to stay objective and keep some subjective distance from the plot. And the book's confession and psychological analysis-like structure are helpful in maintaining it, but it is still difficult to stay unaffected and not to be judgmental. I think we can be grateful to Nabokov for giving us such a deeply explored, fascinating, and disturbing character that affects most of us and makes us question relativity and the limits of morality. and the book's continuing success confirms its compelling argument. Lolita's influence on modern culture is undeniable, and many people know of the concept of Lolita without ever hearing about the novel. To me, personally, Lolita above all is a great piece of literature. Since my connection with the plot is narrow, what I appreciate about Lolita is the form it is written in, the expressive and descriptive language with the sporadic use of French, and the depth and complexity Humbert is presented in with his highly intellectual, analytical, and meticulous personality. This being said, the novel still makes me question the general concept of relativity of morality and how it defines our society. I strongly connect Lolita with Nabokov himself, not to imply he had pedophile fantasies, which I don't know, but with him being a game player, specifically chess, and I see Lolita as a bit of cat and mouse play. So Lolita's interpretations and the personal reaction to it will vary depending on the reader. And that's the beauty of literature. You can often see what you like or want to see. There are a couple of film adaptations. There is the 1960s version directed by Stanley Kubrick and the 90s movie with Jeremy Irons. Both interpretations are fine, but they somewhat simplify the novel, which is understandable considering the obvious limitation of films. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a paperback which I transform into a hardcover, leather-bound edition. To make the cover, I use grade A, naturally tan hide I buy from a tannery in North Spain. It is the same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so the top quality. I do all the processing of the leather myself. First I designed the cover, which what I did here, I used a mid-20th century art with a middle-aged sophisticated man scolding or instructing a young woman, and there are some gifts lying in the background waiting to be unpacked, but only if the girl behaves. All of it could be a scene in Lolita. This is the back with the blurb and the inside front cover with a quote from the book printed. If you want to see a more detailed video where I explain how I transform paperback into hardcover, click on the link in the description. I will make a maximum of 100 editions of each title. Each one will be numbered and initialed, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up, since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100, so if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to leather, and if I can get my hands on the copy of the book. Now, if you're not willing to spend $100, but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel, and for every 100 donations, I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So, if you are cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. One more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to receive. The book itself is beautiful. Visually, it has a very nice texture, it smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So if you want one, don't snooze or you might lose. Well, that's it, so let's end it here, and until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.